And now, live from beautiful Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, you're watching My Fellow Americans with your host, Spike Cohen.
Yes, it's me. It's me. I'm going to explain this. It's me. It is still me. Keep clapping. Clap for the explanation of why I have this thing on my face. How would we know that you wanted an explanation about what this thing is doing on my face if you didn't keep clapping? Welcome to my fellow Americans. I am literally Spike Cohen. And yes, you're saying, why is this thing on my face? Well, as it says there on the screen, I stabbed myself. I was eating very excitedly last night, and one thing led to another. I don't think anyone's proud of this, certainly not me, but I am okay. It does not appear to require stitches, but yeah, I'm a grown man that stabbed myself with a knife, but I'm okay. It was accidental. I did not mean to do it. And yes, I'm doing well. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. This is, of course, a Muddied Waters media production. Check us out on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, anchor.fm/Muddied Waters. Check us out on Twitter, on Periscope, on iTunes, on Google Play, on Twitch. Check us out on all the different podcasting apps. And of course, check us out on float.app/Muddied Waters Media. And then go to our website, muddiedwatersmedia.com. However you are watching this or listening to it, be sure to like, follow, press the button to say I like it. Whatever that is, 5-starring us, whatever thing shows approval and or following on whatever your social media that you're using or podcast that you're using is. Be sure to do that right now. And if it's on YouTube, hit the bell. If there is a bell there, hit the bell next to subscribe. That way your phone will blow up with notifications like mine did as soon as I went live. Every time we go live, we want your phone to just blow up. So be sure to do that and share this right now. The very last thing that we want is for you and your closest loved ones to miss out on a roughly hour-long libertarian podcast on a Wednesday evening. So share this right now. Thank you so much for tuning in. This episode, of course, is brought to you by the Libertarian Party Waffle House Caucus, the fastest growing waffle-related caucus in this or any other party in any other country in this entire godforsaken planet. If you want to become a member of the Libertarian Party Waffle House Caucus, be sure to join today by going to the Facebook group Libertarian Party Waffle House Caucus. And if you want to become an official member, the only way to do that is to buy a button. They're only $5. Just go to muddywatersmedia.com, click on the store icon in the menu, and then you'll see the buttons there. That's one of the many things you can buy at the Muddy Waters Media store to become an official credentialed, seated member of the fastest growing, actually one of the fastest growing caucuses in the party, period, but the fastest growing waffle-related caucus, bar none. This episode, of course, is also brought to you by the Gravy King. And this episode is brought to you by Nug of Knowledge, smokable CBD products. That's what we're doing now. We're smoking our CBD products. We've gone past oil. Now we're smoking. Nug of Knowledge is not like your typical CBD supplier. A portion of all profits go to help end the disastrous war on drugs. They have a compassionate use program that donates medicinal hemp products to veterans and people with disabilities who cannot afford these natural remedies on their own. Many who use it say that it helps them with joint pain, stress relief, or even a much-needed pick-me-up. And, of course, go to nugofknowledge.com. And if you'd like to buy some, you can use checkout code SPIKE for 10% off. This episode is also brought to you by a new sponsor, Joe Solosky, who is running for Pennsylvania governor. Joe Solosky is the key to Pennsylvania's success. If you want to find out how you can help him in his run as a libertarian to be the next and first libertarian governor of Pennsylvania, go to joesolosky.com. That's JoeSoloski.com. I think I spelled that right. And check that out. And finally, of course, this episode and all episodes of anything from Muddy Waters Media will always come to you from Chris Reynolds, personal injury attorney, Chris Reynolds, attorney at law. If you live in Florida, or if you are in Florida and you find yourself personally injured, I have some fantastic news for you. I'm very sorry about what happened that caused you personal injury, but the good news is that if you contact Chris Reynolds, he'll probably be able to get you money. I can't guarantee that, but he will definitely try his darndest. If you go to chrisreynoldslaw.com, he is one of the smartest attorneys I know. Great guy, and he will get you the money that you need. chrisreynoldslaw.com. I cannot guarantee he'll get you the money, but I'd like to think he would, because he's a good attorney. I need to word this better. But again, personally injured, Chris Reynolds attorney, he'll help you. chrisreynoldslaw.com. The intro and outro music to this and every episode of My Fellow Americans comes from the amazing and talented Mr. Joe Davi. That's Jodavi, Joe Davi. Check him out on his Facebook. Go to his SoundCloud. Go to his Bandcamp. Go to jodavimusic.bandcamp.com. Buy his entire discography today. It's like $25. Some of the greatest music you'll ever hear. Be sure to do that. Thank you so much, Mr. Joe Davi. I'd like to thank Le Bleu for this delicious ultra pure water that apparently last night we found out we don't know where this is made, but it's good. It tastes good. It says it's ultra pure, made in the USA, and kosher, and BPA free, like me. I don't know if I'm BPA free. I assume I am. I'm not sure what BPA is. But I am non-carbonated. Anyway, thank you so much for the water. Buluvanaka, that is delicious water. I don't care where they make it. Shout out to Tehran Turks' Mominum as always. Folks, we're doing things a little bit different tonight. I actually interviewed my guest earlier, so I'm about to play a pre-recorded interview that I did with him earlier in the day. I will be live, though, because this is live. I am live right now. In fact, just to prove that I'm live, I'm going to go to the comments right now and respond to someone. Chris Wren says, looks like Spike was personally injured. Maybe he should hire Chris Reynolds. Yeah, but I'd be suing myself, and also I'm not in Florida. So yeah, it's solid theory, but yes. So this is proof that I'm live right now. But I'm going to be playing my interview with a really, really cool guy, Doug Bandow with the Cato Institute. We had a really good conversation. So be sure to check that out. I'll be playing that shortly. I will be responding to your comments and questions as we go live, or as we play it live. And then once it's over, I will be back. I'll answer some of your questions, and then we will be closing out. So no, not hitting myself with a hot dog yet. We didn't get enough money. We are still $900 away, actually $898 away from the opportunity for me to hit myself with a salmon hot dog. If you want to know more, donate $898 and you'll get to see it in real time. So without further ado, here is my interview with Mr. Doug Bandow. You'll want to check this out. This was a lot of fun. Folks, my guest tonight is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, specializing in foreign policy and civil liberties. He worked as a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan, and as the editor of the political magazine Inquiry. He writes regularly for leading publications such as Fortune Magazine, National Interest, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Times, as well as antiwar.com. His works can be found at cato.org. Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Americans, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming my guest, Mr. Doug Bandow. Doug, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Happy to come on.
This is a very interesting subject we're going to be talking about with the kind of creeping authoritarianism that's happening around the country, and I'm really excited to get your take on that.
No, it's quite a time. I mean, I've been in Washington for more than 40 years, and we've never quite had a time like this one. It's quite a challenge for all of us, especially people interested in the freedom ideology.
Absolutely. And folks, be sure to comment with your questions and thoughts. And this is being pre-recorded, but I will be there live to tell you whether you are right or wrong. Now, Doug, before we get started, I always ask my guests whenever they come on and they're a specialist in something, what is it that got you into wanting to be a specialist in civil liberties and foreign policy? Was it a aha moment, or sort of a gradual evolution of time? Tell us the Bandow genesis story.
Well, to some degree, I'm a generalist, and those are areas of particular fascination. Now, I have a bachelor's in economics. I have a law degree. I went into the Reagan administration, focusing much more on economic issues. I worked for Ronald Reagan's his domestic policy advisor, Martin Anderson, who I met actually while I was in Stanford Law School. He was at the Hoover Institution. So I spent my early years focused on domestic issues, economics, regulation, legal issues. But I always had an interest in international issues. My father was in the Air Force. I spent part of my youth in the United Kingdom and Germany. I found those issues very interesting, so I started writing about them. And just over time, quite frankly, I came to the point where, in the 1980s, 1990s, I'd look back and say I was writing about these same issues when I was in law school on the domestic side, minimum wage, Social Security, budget deficits.
Right.
But international issues were changing, and they were incredibly fascinating. Fall of the Berlin Wall, changes in other countries, collapse of communism. So that really pushed me much more towards the international issues. And civil liberties kind of carry, my interest in the law gets into that, as well as some of it's international. I do international religious persecution. It allows me to get that international flavor, but also, liberties for folks as well.
Well, and that's actually one of the things we're going to be talking about is religious persecution around the world. Now, to preface this, I wish I could say that this was going to be a boring episode, that we were going to talk about how things are just kind of staying the same, maybe getting a little bit better. But unfortunately, and you probably didn't need to see a report to know this for the folks at home, but unfortunately, things are kind of slowly getting worse around the world. According to the most recent 2021 report by Freedom House, America is less free, or actually the world is less free than it has been in quite some time. In 2005, there were 89 countries that were considered mostly free or free. That's gone down to 82, and the number of countries that are considered either partly free or not free has continued to steadily rise. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the religious persecution aspect of that. The first one is something that a lot of people I don't think have heard about. We've heard about the Rohingya. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Yeah, Rohingya in right. Myanmar, the Uyghur Muslims in China. We've heard a lot about this, but we haven't heard about the Jehovah's Witnesses. So in Russia, back in 2017, Jehovah's Witnesses were declared an extremist religious group, but that didn't really start to heat up until a few weeks ago. Can you tell us a little bit about that and where that started?
Well, the Jehovah's Witnesses are a small, in a sense, Christian offshoot. I mean, they're not Orthodox Christian, but they spring, they take the Bible as their authority. They have some doctrines that don't fit with kind of majority Christians. Nevertheless, they're very much part of the Western experience. I mean, I have relatives who are Jehovah's Witnesses. They're relatively small. I mean, they're kind of famous for, going door to door. I mean, they're very much evangelized. They try to spread their faith. And these are folks who were famous in the legal sense because back in the 1940s, there were two Supreme Court cases because what they do is they respect state authority, but they refuse to, in a sense, recognize it. That is, they won't be in a position where it appears they're worshiping it. So they wouldn't do the Pledge of Allegiance. What their view is, they don't interfere with anybody else. But for them, that's venerating, it's kind of giving almost kind of, a worship towards, a state symbol. So there were two Supreme Court cases. The first said they had to do it. The second, thankfully, said the Constitution protected them. So they're a fairly minor sect, but they've tended to be victimized overseas. And for some reason, Russia has really gotten after them. And my assessment, I mean, most of the countries that persecute either are, frankly, Islamic, majority Islamic, or they're authoritarian former communist. That is, that they have that background of state control. In Russia is one of the few, it has that, but it's also Orthodox Church tends to be very closely identified with state authority. So I think what happened here is to some degree, it's simply they acknowledge Protestantism, Catholicism as being, kind of respected religions, but Jehovah's Witnesses just don't fit. I mean, their resistance to kind of symbolism of the state, their tendency to evangelize, and they've been designated essentially as a terrorist group. It's utterly crazy that, these are, I mean, I don't mean it in an offensive way. They're harmless. I mean, these are not people who want to undermine the state, that have no interest in bothering anybody. And they have been just viciously victimized, where they're arrested, their buildings have been taken, the church officially has been closed down. They meet, they're subject to penalties. I mean, it's extraordinary. And it's gotten worse in recent years.
So you're saying they've been essentially labeled in a terrorist group. Has there ever, I mean, I think I probably know the answer to this already. Has there been an actual incident of Jehovah's Witnesses engaging in or threatening any terrorism? Or is this, and I guess a follow-up question to that is, you mentioned both the aspect of that, this is a former communist state, and there's that aspect of controlling religions and sort of suppressing religions, but also the fact that they're from the Orthodox Church. Which of these would you say is more of a factor in this, or is it really kind of a combination of the two?
I think they both fit. That is, the authoritarian nature of the Russian system really does. I mean, you can argue it goes back to Imperial Russia, then through the Soviet Union. But
Right.
there's a history. Russia's democratic moment was very short under Boris Yeltsin. And
Yeah.
then Putin took over and really moved much more in authoritarian direction. So that's all there. So I think that's the base. And I do think the Orthodox Church, for example, does not like those who evangelize. And that's happened with the Greek Orthodox Church as well. I mean, look, what happens in these countries is nothing compared to Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan. I mean, the country, Iran. I mean, countries like that are just vicious what they do. The
Right.
Orthodox, but they do tend to penalize people who are going out and evangelizing, proselytizing. And the Jehovah's Witnesses have a reputation for that. So my guess is that the two have kind of come together. There was a Supreme Court case in Russia that said they fell within these provisions of being kind of a dangerous group. And at that point, I mean, the full power of the state went upon them. Putin at one point wondered why this is all happening. And I think it does give a sense that while he's broadly in charge, he's the top guy. I mean, a lot of stuff happens there, and it's not clear this is all directed by him. But
Right.
he's never tried to intervene to stop it. And in recent months, it's gotten worse.
That is unfortunate. And the thing is, I live somewhere where Jehovah's Witnesses come a lot. And so it's that, Saturday morning,
Yes.
if you fell asleep downstairs on the couch, they're going to wake you up knocking on the door. But we've never had a problem with them or anything like that, other than we wish they wouldn't knock on our door. But that obviously doesn't rise to the level of terrorism. And this is also similar to non-religious stuff in Russia, like people that are proclaiming LGBT rights or protesting the abuses and excesses of the Putin administration. They're also being targeted. So it's pretty much anyone that doesn't fall into a very narrow line of what Putin would like to see, or what the Russian government would like to see,
That's right.
including Jehovah's Witnesses, who it would be argued that this is kind of a standard, or at least an old school Christian take on your relationship with the state. You respect its existence, but you don't recognize it as an authority because you only recognize one authority. And it seems like that's kind of, biting them right now.
But the irony is they don't resist. There's no active resistance. I mean, they don't
Right.
hold protests. They don't, stage tax resistance. I mean, it's like in the U.S., they got in trouble because they refused to give the Pledge of Allegiance.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of it. I mean, it's not, they didn't want to serve. I mean, they were willing to be, kind of do alternative service. They wouldn't serve,
Right.
in the military role. But that's kind of it. It's not as if these were active subversives. And
Right.
that's what makes it such a tragedy is there's such a small group. They're very serious believers. I mean, these people were persecuted by the Nazis. I mean, they ended up in concentration camps. So the Jehovah's Witnesses are very serious folks, and they're being punished for no reason. I mean, it makes no sense.
Yeah, it is very unfortunate. And as you mentioned, there are parts of the world, particularly in many Muslim countries, where repression of other religions, all the way to banning other religions, is
Oh, yeah.
kind of standard fare. So we're focusing more on things that are new and divergent things that are happening. These are things that are kind of coming up and getting worse. For example, Saudi Arabia, it's been the status quo from the beginning that, there's a very, very strict what you can and cannot do, even as a foreigner practicing a non-Sunni
There's
religion.
no open religious practice by non-Muslims, and Shia Muslims are highly repressed. I mean, so that's relative, basically conversion, apostasy. These things can get the death penalty. This is
Right,
fairly
yeah.
common in a number of countries.
Yeah, they have a mild amount of tolerance of, for example, like foreigners who are there for energy sector jobs and things like that in their own territories and areas,
their own
very
that's
quietly and very quietly
In
and
your own
humbly
compound,
practicing.
You don't cause trouble. You don't
Yeah.
tell anybody. It's fine. They won't bother you. But if you're outside that protected kind of existence, then you're in trouble.
Yeah, no, if you're an actual Saudi, then no, you have to be a Sunni Muslim, or you have to be very quiet about it.
I mean, a lot of it's the foreigners, the expatriates who are brought in. Because, I mean, they bring in Filipinos, there's some Pakistani Christians and others. These are folks, Hindus. I mean, if you're that expatriate group, you get in real trouble if you try to worship separately.
Right. And so speaking of Muslims in Myanmar, or as some people know it as Burma, we're seeing right now that there is a coup that has taken place. And I'm not sure, and you can give a little bit more about this. This is a coup that, did it ever really stop? Because my understanding was that the president was still active. The I forget her name, the lady that they've deposed, she was still actively involved in continuing the repression. Some would call it the genocide of the Rohingya Muslims, of the Karen people. So I mean, is this just the same policy but with the military face instead of the elected official face, or was there a break in that when she was in charge?
It's complicated. I've actually done a lot of work with the Karen. I've been over the border many times. I mean, the good news is, as of roughly a decade ago, the fighting stopped. I mean, I've been there when there was active combat. So most of the ethnic groups have had a fairly, they've had a ceasefire that for the most part has held. Look, in 1962 was the original military coup. The junta ruled brutally, for years. Back in the 80s, there was an election. Her party won it, at which point the military voided the results. There were massive protests. She spent about 15 years under house arrest. So back in around 2010, they decided, and a lot of this is, I think the military, the general assessment is it's a very independent military. The Chinese embrace was very close because the US and Europeans had sanctions. India and Japan had some involvement, but for the most part, they were very isolated. So China was their main benefactor and main trading partner. And that they were very uncomfortable with that. So the military decided to come up with a hybrid system. So the military had elections. They maintained control of kind of essentially the Interior Ministry, the Defense Ministry, and one of the other it's basically the kind of border defense or border control ministry. And they held 25% of parliament. They got to a point. And, then they ran the military separately. And then they had a civilian government. And what they did in the Constitution was ban Aung San Suu Kyi, from becoming president. They put in the provision that prevented anybody with a foreign relative from being president. Well, she had been married to a British man who died of cancer, and she still had two British citizen sons. So that it was put in there just to stop her. So she ended up creating a new position as state counselor that, as she explained, was above the president. So her party won a big victory 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And the betting is the military thought that they were going to get a fractured parliament and that they could put together essentially a coalition and rule. And they didn't get that. And then last November, there was another election. Her ruling party won an even bigger margin. The Rohingya, the military has been in charge. She basically defended them, and actually at The Hague, there was a case and she went there to defend their conduct. I think what we found out was, number one, is she's a Burman nationalist. She's with the majority ethnic Burmese, as opposed to the Karen, the Wa, the Chin, and all the other ethnic groups.
Yep.
In the end, she is a nationalist. And I think that, that didn't mean she's not for democracy. It just means, well, guess what? She's not one of us. She's in the sense of she's not a liberal for whom, that you would set aside the nationalism.
Right.
I wouldn't blame her for all of it. She didn't control the military. I assume part of that was a political judgment on her part. I do think she could have done more. There are there are journalists who've gone to jail. There are a lot of things where it strikes many of us that she did fail to give us much better democracy, but she's far better than the generals. So the view here is that basically the ruling general wanted to be president, and she basically told him to screw himself. That the idea that she'd hand the presidency to him after he rigged the system, and now he's simply upset because he didn't get as much as he wanted, that he decided to move. And I think the other thing, the fact they won an even bigger margin told the military that that she and her party were winning. It's going to be hard for the military to withstand successive, 80% majorities, controlling parliament, having all the civilian offices. They decided they wanted to grab it back. And I think the end game was essentially the Thailand system, which was they're going to disqualify her, disqualify the party, rig the political system, use everything to kind of make sure they win the votes they want. And then they hope they can rule through a fractured parliament. That's essentially what the Thai generals did. They staged a coup in 2014. They rigged the system, really cheated at every stage. So the junta leader is now prime minister. It's not working out well. I mean, the Mayan, the Myanmar or the Burmese, people are resisting. They've had 18 people got killed a couple of days ago in protests. They're continuing. So it's a mess. I'm not sure how it's going to turn out.
Yeah, and obviously that's for the Burmese people. Then for the ethnic minority groups like the Rohingya, who are actually they're refugees who fled across the border into Bangladesh originally. So they're not only are they an ethnic minority, they're not actually native to Bangladesh, at least up until recently. So it's unfortunate to see. How do you think? I mean, obviously you don't have a crystal ball, but do you think that this is going to be a people's revolt that overturns the junta, or do they have the kind of power to just wait it out and until things calm down and just retain control?
Well, the junta has been very bloody in the past. I mean, back in I think it was 87, and then there was a revolt led by a lot of the Buddhist monks. I think it was 2007. Both of those had a lot of shooting and a lot of dead people. One of the interesting things this time is that civil servants have gotten into it. So basically you've had bank employees, and people at the different ministries refusing to do their work. So the government has had a hard time making, the process work. If they continue that, it's going to be, it's hard for the military to run everything if they get constant strikes and resistance. The problem is people have to feed themselves at some point. I do think this is going to be a lot tougher. I'm worried that the military at some point just starts shooting. In the past, they had no hesitancy. We hoped over the last decade that we had a new crew who were less likely to do so. But everything I've heard about the junta leader is bad. This is not, kind of a friendly, warm and fuzzy guy. And the military is very independent, believes they should run things. So I worry. This could get very, very ugly. And it's not easy for the West to intervene. They put sanctions on military figures and military, commercial enterprises, but we don't have a lot of easy ways in there.
And you don't have a lot of leverage because because of years of sanctions and separation between the U.S. economy and the Bangladeshi one. There's not really much you can threaten. When it comes, so there was buried in the among the many provisions of the last stimulus bill that was to pass at the end of last year was, I think, $158 million that was going towards. I think it was fighting against gender and ethnic-based violence. And I remember remarking, I actually posted it, I said, it sounds like the U.S. government is about to give like close to $250 million to a military-run government that has a history of, I don't know about specifically gender-based violence, I guess, except for what they do to their president, but, of definitely ethnic-based violence. Was there an actual plan behind that, or was that just pissing money away that they knew was going to be used poorly?
Well, look, the question of whether the Burmese government before the coup had capacity to use that money well, I'd be somewhat skeptical, but it was going to go to civilian ministry. That is, in fact, the National League for Democracy, that is Aung San Suu Kyi's party, controlled all the civilian ministries. And she acted as effective head of state. There's a president, which she couldn't be, but then she's the state counselor who told the president what to do. So in that sense, the military didn't have direct control over it. I don't know if that money's been delivered. I think all aid, money have been shut off at the moment.
Right.
So the U.S. government has tried to halt any kind of cash going in. The Europeans too. The Japanese are still involved. A number of companies are pulling out. Who wants to invest where this whole place can go up in flames? But the military, like I said, in 1962 was the coup. They basically spent 50 years isolated. They're quite willing. They know what they've gotten into. They know
what that's like.
They don't want to be dependent on the Chinese, but they're willing to do it if they have to. And the Chinese, I think, will pick up the slack if they believe it gives them political benefits.
Well, and transitioning into the Chinese, because that is a template for what's happening in Bangladesh as well. There are many different things on the front of China that is, very repressive of the Chinese people. One that's been becoming more prominent and spoken about, at least in the Western world, is the repression or the crisis of the Uyghur Muslim people who live in the, I guess, the north, typically, or in like the north and northeast.
It's kind of northwest.
Yeah. And we've heard reports of rape camps where they're basically eliminating the Uyghur people through having Han Chinese men raping Uyghur women to basically, dilute their bloodline. Some have referred to it as a genocide. Our president has referred to it as a different cultural norm. What is your take on what's happening among the Uyghur? Because I've heard, especially in libertarian circles, I've heard everything from this is one of the worst things that's happening on the planet right now to this is, neoconservative imperialist propaganda against the Chinese government and it's way overblown. What is your take on what's happening there?
Look, it's hard to be too harsh on the Chinese government these days. I mean, one has to be very careful. Like, I'm very much against a Cold War. Like, I've been to China more than I've been to any other country, other than like to German airports. I mean, if you count landing in Munich and Frankfurt onto somewhere else, I've been to Germany more. I've been to China at least 20 times. I've spoken at universities there a dozen times. I mean, I've been on trips. I have friends there. I mean, China is a fascinating, fantastic, incredible culture. The government's bad. And I worry, like I've just been listening, there's a group, a left-wing dominated group that's kind of no Cold War and anti-war, which is good. It's trying to bring people together. But right before we started, I've been listening, I'm transcribing some comments where you have people on the left who are basically whitewashing the Chinese government. Everything's wonderful, they're fabulous, and it's nonsense. I mean, it's simply nonsense. I mean, this is a regime under Xi Jinping. So we go back. I mean, it started getting harsh before that, but he became party secretary in 2012, president in 2013. He has, at almost every level, tightened control. And that means tightening control over the internet, destroyed what had been an active human rights bar, wiped out independent journalists, a huge persecution against every religion, Christianity, Islam, Taoism, Buddhism, I mean, everything. Internet controls are far tougher. I mean, it's brutal stuff. And it controls little controls over academia. A year and a half ago, I showed up in Shanghai to give a presentation on U.S. Indo-Pacific kind of policy. I'd spoken at this conference 2 years before. I showed up, this is 2019, and I was picked up at the airport Friday night, and the person picking me up said, "Oh, well, we found out yesterday that we can't have any foreigners speak without having gotten the approval of Beijing," which was impossible in the time they had. So guess what? We are doing tourism tomorrow. And I was the only American there, but there were Asians, the same thing. And then I was supposed to give an address to students on Sunday. And I met informally with some of the conference people at my hotel that day. And this is how we have a libertarian group that's spoken 10 years. I've done it 7 of them, given at the School of Marxism at Northeastern University in Shenyang. We give free market economic seminars. Until 2019, the school invited us. We said yes. They brought us over, and off we went. 2019, we had to file this big long form, send photos, explain when we'd been to China, answer questions about what groups did we belong to. All of that was shipped off to the education department in Beijing. They had to decide to let us in. Cato, for years, worked with a group called the Uni-Rule Institute. I mean, it was headed by a fellow named Mao, not Mao Zedong. It was a different family, but a family named his family.
Different Mao, yeah.
But I mean, they were always very careful. They didn't attack the Communist Party. They advocated free market economic reform. Mm-hmm. And for years, I mean, Cato gave them the Friedman Prize. I think it was back in 2012. So we, our group that would do these teaching every summer in Northeastern University, we typically do a conference with the Uni-Rule Institute afterwards. These would be advertised. They would be open. People could come. I mean, again, we're all careful. I mean, when we taught at the university, we never directly attacked the CCP. Students are smart enough. You talk about how the U.S. government screwed something up. We figure they can make connections. And off hours, you can talk about. I mean, I was asked in class about Tiananmen Square. I mean, other stuff where you're like, Oh boy. I mean, these students were willing to, ask questions. Muni rule, like when in 2019, I went, we were there, and then two of us, Barun Mitra, who's a wonderful free market Indian and, economist that heads a small think tank in India. And I went out to see our friends. Well, they were kind of pushed to the third headquarters. They'd been kicked out of the first two in Beijing. And at that point, the executive director couldn't travel. Their books could not be published. And they were in the final stages of having their business license pulled. And shortly after we were there, they were closed down by the state. So stuff that, Xinjiang, I think it's real. Now, I worry about use of word genocide simply because these are not death camps and we're not killing people. So I always worry genocide, and people use concentration camps. You think Nazis. You think, you think the Chinese, what the Chinese are effectively doing is trying to destroy Uyghur and Muslim culture. And this dates back roughly to 2017. There are some terrorist incidents. China does not say try to find the guilty parties. China says we must crush, radical Islam. So the way we do that is to try to force all of these people no longer to be Muslims. That's very repressive. People have applications on their phones. They get stopped at checkpoints. Police look at their phones. They've put Han Chinese into people's homes to essentially spy on them. Children have been taken from their parents. And the estimates are up to 1 million people in re-education, essentially camps, forced labor. We don't know for sure the numbers, and people have criticized some of the numbers. Who knows? You're trying to count that sort of thing. But we have lots of evidence. We have satellite footage of camps. We have anecdotal evidence. We have people who've escaped. We have relatives around the world who've been pressured by their families and the Chinese government not to say anything lest bad things happen to their families.
Right.
This is real. So I think we have to understand is that what's going on in China is awful. Now, it doesn't mean we should go to war. It doesn't mean a Cold War makes sense. And it certainly doesn't mean isolate them. People complain and say, oh, everything failed, right? We traded with them. They were supposed to become democratic. And so I would admit I was overly optimistic, and others were as well. But I would argue that, in fact, Western engagement has been a great success. 1976, Mao Zedong dies. China was at the end point of the Cultural Revolution. If you want to read a horrible story, I'm reading a book right now, The End of the World. It's 700 pages long. It's on the Cultural Revolution. It was madness. It was a civil war. It was a purge. It was Mao Zedong at his lunatic worst.
This is post Great Leap Forward or during the Great Leap Forward? Yes,
this is post Great Leap Forward. Great Leap Forward was like 58 through 60 or something. So Great Leap Forward killed tens of millions of people. It was a mass famine. The same author wrote a book on the Great Leap Forward. So that's my next book. Really, fun reading these days. But the tens of millions of people died in that. It was so bad that the Communist Party cadre, essentially forced Mao to back away on it. And he lost authority because it was so awful. He used the Cultural Revolution in a sense to try to reestablish control. He started it in 66. It went on for roughly 10 years. They figure at least 1 million people died in it. It was all over the country. It's fighting, it's factions. People, a mob shows up and beat people to death. Madness. This is 1976. Mao dies. He's gone. Other members of his clique, the Gang of Four, they called it, they're all arrested. Deng Xiaoping takes charge, and all of a sudden we do economic reform. And what you have is a China that suddenly grows economically. People have autonomy. When I first went there, they still, trying to get married. You need state approval. Where you worked, you needed state approval. I was there. My first trip was back in 92. They were finally getting out of that. So I would argue that what they got from that is rapid economic growth and expanded private, sector. Even politics, with Tiananmen Square, there were real liberals and they lost. But it was always a looser system. Like, universities can invite Westerners. We can have conversations. There was a looseness there as long as you didn't directly challenge the Communist Party. All of that, in my view, came out of kind of Western engagement. And Xi Jinping has reversed that. But look, the guy can be gone tomorrow and then the world changes. Mao Zedong dies. His pictures are still there, but his ideology disappeared. It was wiped away almost instantly. So my view on this is it's critical that we be honest about what China is. And I know libertarians who are hesitant to do that because they're afraid it gives aid and comfort to hawks. But my
Right.
reaction is if you want to defeat the hawks, you got to be honest about what you're facing. The last thing you want to do is kind of act as if you're some nitwit. No, everything's wonderful. It's not. I mean, it
No,
really
because
is not. I mean, I have Chinese friends. It's a different world. What they say, how they talk, it's bad now. So let's not
yeah.
hide that. The question is, how do you help that? One of it is trying to break their censorship. Another is don't play nationalist games. I mean, Pompeo directly attacks the Communist Party. I hate the Communist Party. But if you're attacking it that way, you're much more likely to drive it and the people together. They're nationalists. They defend their government. No, I mean, so the question is, how do you appeal to young people who are kind of liberal? They're still nationalists, but they don't like
Right.
government controls. We need to think strategically as opposed to, kind of a blunderbuss approach and take into account where they are on human rights as well as everything else.
Yeah, and the thing is, going back to what you said, in our zeal not to accept the narrative of the neocons and the war hawks, we need not just become anti-U.S. reactionaries. That if they
Yeah.
say something is happening, then we just assume it isn't,
Yeah.
because this isn't a U.S. problem of repressive governments that lie to the people. That is a government problem. China is an example of a repressive government that lies to its people and harms them as well. So we need to have a holistic approach to how we're looking. It's okay for both sides to be bad. This is not where it's not a binary thing. And, when it comes to what's happening specifically with what you're talking about in China, this is also an example of how things are not static. You talked about how coming out of the Cultural Revolution, there was this sort of gradual evolution towards better conditions and more money for the people, more economic growth, rapid hyper economic growth, as well as growth, social growth, and being able to say more and being able to be more involved and being able to have more freedom. And I do believe that the war hawks that, as you said, like play the nationalist games, they want the CCP and the people of China to get more together. The whole point is to create that adversarial nature to justify the military-industrial complex, embargoes, all of the things that they like. That this is part of the neocon, neo-lib world order, is creating this sort of counter-nationalist balance and saber rattling constantly happening to justify spending trillions of dollars on military increases and to keep a constant aggressive war footing around the world. So you have this sort of two increasingly authoritarian governments playing off of one another. We talk a lot about the repression of people in their own countries, right? So, the Chinese people being oppressed in China. We were talking about different people, Burmese people and other ethnic minorities in Burma that are being repressed, and people in Russia that are being repressed, but in their countries. There's a concept of something called transnational repression, where citizens of a country that aren't even in that country are being repressed. That's very common in China, Russia, Iran, Turkey. I would argue in the U.S., I think FATCA is a repression of Americans living abroad, that it doesn't matter where you earn your income. You better give double digits of it back to us, or we're going to make your life miserable even over there. But talk to me about what transnational repression is. And is that has technology made that something where it's a new phenomenon, or is this something that's been around for a long time?
Well, I think technology's made it a lot easier. Look, I mean, after the Russian Revolution, I mean, you had a lot of white Russians in Europe, and a number of them got assassinated. I mean, Soviet agents went hunting down, whether they be monarchists or Democrats or whatever else. I mean, and there was certainly throughout the Cold War. I mean, there's a famous case of, I think it was a Bulgarian dissident. I don't remember if he's in London and was killed. It was like, using this, an umbrella that shot, poison pellets into him, this kind of a thing.
Yeah.
That and there were cases where we were pretty certain that white Russians and others got kidnapped, almost certainly taken back to the Soviet Union. So you had a bit of that, but of course that's dicier stuff. I mean, that's you have to physically have your agents there, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And in most of these cases, the question is whether you had hostages or not. I mean, I think in most of these cases, most of the family members who didn't make it out were probably dead. So I mean, for the most part, You didn't have, an ability to hold a family hostage.
There was no leverage, right?
That's right. That, I think, is what has really changed. I mean, you certainly see that with Iran and particularly with China. I mean, lots of cases of Uyghurs where, you get people here will say, my family doesn't want to talk to me anymore. Or my family has asked me not to do any activism. There have been cases. There was one yesterday. There was actually a webinar. They were talking about this. A woman coming on saying, that she held off saying anything. I mean, a sister of hers disappeared, and then her sister was sentenced to like 17 years in prison for something. And she said at that point, okay, I'm going to speak out. So I think that they're more vulnerable now. And we even have cases where it appears of them sending people to America or using people already in America to kind of talk to and to try to coerce and frighten, people. And to me, that's one of those things where, this is where I think we need united, kind of cooperation. That is the U.S., Europeans, Asian democracies. I think this is one of those areas. I think another one is like websites. I mean, China tells United Airlines on your website in America, you can't list Taiwan.
Right.
My reaction is, look, you can, whatever you want to do in China. I mean, I don't like it, but you can do it, but not here. And so to me, these are areas where it makes sense for democratic countries to come together and say, okay, we got a problem here. We cannot let them do this to us.
Right.
And what do we do about it? And if we all work together, and to me, then suddenly you have real leverage where all the Western countries say, no, if you do that, X happens, whatever X is. But I think it has gotten worse. I mean, I think it's the vulnerability of fairly large expatriate populations and the technology of following people online, of, checking what they've been saying. I mean, all of these things have made it easier then for a state like China to watch, to get in communication with, to threaten, those sorts of things. So I think it's a real problem.
So one example that comes up of not just transnational repression of citizens in other countries, but citizens of other countries in other countries. One is China basically telling a lot of the entertainment industry, if you want to be able to, sell your movies here, not only can your movies that are here, that we have here, not have anything negative about us, you can't ever say anything negative about us anywhere, or we're not going to allow it here, which is kind of what you're talking about. They're now repressing here using basically the power of the purse, that leverage that they have. So no, it is a major problem. So up until now, we've complained a lot. We've talked a lot about all the problems that we are facing. And I'm going to complain one more time, because for anyone who said, well, that's okay, because back here in the good old US of A, we're free as can be. Yeah, no, not so much. So it turns out that according to Freedom House, we've seen a roughly 10%, actually just over 10%, 11-point decline in our level of freedom in the last 10 years. The three major factors being increasing political corruption and conflicts of interest, lack of transparency in government, and punitive immigration and asylum policies. And to be clear, this is not a Trump problem. This is not an Obama problem. This is not a Republican or Democrat problem. This is, I call it a Republicrat problem. This is a U.S. government policy, neoliberal / neoconservative, centrist world order policy problem that has led to it. Now, with a few minutes to go, since we've complained this whole time, let's talk some solutions. What are the things that you think need to be done? And this can be at the individual level, the advocacy level, or even at the government level, that can be done to work towards us being freer here in the States, and also to work towards creating more freedom. I think we agree that, liberating the world through military policy certainly isn't the way. So what is the way?
Right. Well, I think domestically, it requires an active citizenry who cares. I mean, ultimately, we get the government that, if not necessarily what we deserve, but we get the government that in some ways we accept or we acquiesce to. That we have to hold public officials don't believe they can have adult conversations with us. We are bankrupt and we're spending money wildly. Well, who's going to pay? I mean, we're already over, debt is 100% of GDP. By mid-century, CBO says it could be 150 or 200%. Well, Greece was something like 140% when it blew up.
Yep.
I mean, we need to have a conversation about, well, what are you willing to spend money on? And if you want to spend, you got to tax. I mean, you just can't. So it strikes me that we need citizens who take the citizenship seriously, and say that there's no free lunch. I mean, Milton Friedman had that right. And then we have to talk to public officials and make decisions. And we can't do, and it strikes me, it ultimately comes back, and people have to, there are trade-offs. There's everything. I mean, freedom, responsibility, money, programs, there's nothing free here. So to me, that's kind of the starting point for us. And we have to be willing to accept some cost. If we want freedom, we're going to have to pay for it. I mean, it requires us to be vigilant. It requires us to,
Right.
be willing to make certain sacrifices to protect the system, that we have. I think internationally, I mean, one thing we need to do is, as much as we can, is use individuals as well as government. I tell people the best ambassadors for America are citizens. I mean, the point is, for the most part, people around the world like Americans. And most of those people hate the U.S. government. And for very good reasons, frankly. And when it's off bombing people, invading, killing people,
Yep.
I mean, doing a lot of sanctioning people, starving them to death. I mean, the U.S. government does a lot of awful stuff. And the Chinese have pointed this out. I wrote a column for antiwar.com saying, look, let's be very frank. Since the Cultural Revolution, that is, after the Cultural Revolution on, the Chinese have done nothing as harmful as the Iraq War. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis are dead because of U.S. policy. We didn't kill them. We blew the place up. The Chinese have not done anything like that. Now, they've done lots of bad stuff, but if they didn't blow it up. They didn't create Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which our policy did. All this stuff, we need to own this. We have to accept responsibility for our own actions. Then we have more credibility in criticizing, China. So I think part of it is getting people active. I mean, things like the Olympics. I mean, the Olympic Committee is not going to take the Olympics away, but we need to work with other countries. For example, government should boycott. No heads of state, no heads of government should go. No royalty should go. We should suggest that athletes who go there use the opportunity to protest, use the opportunity to highlight abuses. Be careful. I mean, you don't want to start, get yourself arrested. But you can imagine you win some event and the microphone's in front of you. I mean, you can say something that we should look for ways to use the opportunity to embarrass, the Chinese government. And I do think cooperation, I mean, the problem with the Trump administration was that, we just order everybody to do things and they don't do it for good reason. We need to sit down, with countries and say, again, how do you deal with the pressure put on companies? It's very hard to tell a Hollywood studio that you should, not listen to them and lose money. Well, what we need to do is then how do you get an industry to work together? You may need an antitrust exemption. How do we work, across countries? How do we, I mean, the best thing you can do to the Chinese is say all the Western airlines together have a policy. We do our websites and you stay out of it. And if you want to kick one of us out, you kick all of us out, that kind of a thing. So how do we build, to me, that's what we can help on that. We can't make it happen. But that's something, and then I think that's where you want awareness of the problems. You want an active citizenry. And this needs to be bipartisan. It's not blame one party. Both parties have this issue. This is something all Americans and good people around the world should want to do. How do you help Chinese people? And this is, it's not a part of, to me, you don't want it being led by the U.S. government on a crusade against China. You want it led by people who say terrible things are being done to the Chinese people. We want to work with them. We want to help them. And you work together as opposed to this is our effort because Donald Trump's mad about trade or something. It's not going to be easy, but I do have hopes that we could get people together because China is a serious challenge. And I say it's a challenge. This is not war. This is not the Soviet Union. It's not a Cold War. It's a very different thing, but we have to take it seriously. But we also have to take into account it's important to engage in all these other things. This is, and we need to be careful about this, but I think we can win it. And I have a lot of confidence in America and Western countries. I mean, I think we have fundamental strengths, but we're going to have to work at it.
And as you said, it's hard to get anywhere until we clean up our own house. Yeah. If we're engaging in, and I say we, I mean our government, if we continue to be robbed to pay for an imperialist government to spread havoc around the world and create terror groups and engage in mass murder and targeted killings and, holding people in Gitmo without trial until they die, as long as we're doing that, or as long as our government is doing that, then we and our government look like hypocrites telling anyone else that they shouldn't do anything, which immediately cuts and curtails our ability to be able to affect things abroad. That's why we have to vote libertarian. You didn't say that, I did. But so...
I vote libertarian, so no worries.
Okay, well then he said it too. That's why you got to vote libertarian. So step number one, vote libertarian. So Doug, thank you so much for coming on. You have been a fascinating guest, and this has been a really interesting discussion. It's interesting in the way that like talking about, like a serial killer is interesting. It's like a horrific, terrible thing, but it's interesting to talk about, and it's good for us to know that these things are happening so we can talk about how to fight against it and combat it. Before I let you go, I want to give you a chance to have the final word. You can say whatever you want to say, whatever you thought we didn't get a chance to talk about, promote any upcoming, anything you're doing, plug yourself and all of your various wares, whatever you want to say, as long as you want to say it. Doug Bandow, the floor is yours.
Well, obviously, I'd love to have people, check me out on Twitter. Go to the Cato Institute website. It has most of what I write. Has a lot of forums that I've been in, policy papers that I've written. I write regularly for antiwar.com. I want to talk that up. Eric Garris and the crew out there, Scott Horton, do fabulous work. It's an effort to try to, it's to counteract the war party, counteract the neoconservatives.
Yes.
They operate on a shoestring, but they're hardcore. They're very principled. American Conservative is an interesting publication. It's not libertarian. It doesn't pretend to be, but they're very open. I write for them weekly. National Interest. I even write for American Spectator, National Review Online. Whoever is out there, I want to get the message out. I promote liberty. So I'd love to have people look for my writings and look for webinars and stuff. But again, Cato website's probably the best place, and has a lot of other good work on it. I have a lot of very fine colleagues, people who work very hard on civil liberties, drug legalization, on how to deal with police abuse, legal reform, constitutional reform, as well as foreign policy, deregulation. So we'd love to have people visiting us, and hey, if you have a little extra money, throw it Cato's way.
Awesome. So Doug Bandow, you're on Twitter. Is it at Doug Bandow?
Yeah, it's like D Bond. They put my name in.
If they type Doug Bandow, then they'll find you. Yeah. So the beauty is, as far as I could tell when I was doing some research on you, there's only one Doug Bandow. So if you type in Doug Bandow, you're going to find this specific Doug Bandow. That makes it a lot easier. So check him out on Twitter. Check him out on antiwar.com, cato.org, National Interest, Fortune, American Conservative, all the others that he was saying. Doug, again, thank you so much for coming on. And like Doug said, vote libertarian. He did say it. Doug, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
Happy to have been on. It's been fun. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm back. It's me. I'm back. Wasn't that great? Doug Bandow is fantastic. That was a really great discussion about transnational repression and religious persecution. A couple times it was mentioned in the comments, well, we also do that stuff here, or maybe not as bad, but we also are abusive to people here and very abusive to people around the world. Well, yeah, we know that. That's not anything new. We talk about that quite a bit. We don't talk a lot about foreign policy on this show because I think it's more important, as we said at the end of the interview with Doug, that we really need to clean up our house before we can go around and tell others what they should be doing. But I did think it was important to have that opportunity to see what is going on in other countries. So before I go, I guess I can take a couple of questions. If any of y'all have any questions, I'll take maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then we will wrap things up. So he is, I don't know. Yeah, Connor, I don't know if he's on Facebook. I didn't find him on Facebook, but he is on Twitter. It's at Doug_Bandow. And Brian has it in the comments. I'll put it up in the main comment so everyone can see it. But it's Twitter at Doug_Bandow. I'm putting that up right now. That is not. It made it into a Facebook link. There we go. So no, that was a really good episode. And if anyone has any questions, I can answer 1 or 2 questions. And if not, then I'm going to go eat because I have some really, really good air-fried salmon that's waiting for me. And I am very, very excited. Why is this coming up like this? Because I wrote Dave. Okay, ignore that last one. Let me put it in again. I can't believe I put Dave Bandow. Yeah, I'm not okay. I won't stab myself. Um, you're right though. This is how excited I was last time, Justin, when I got the food, and yes, it was salmon. I was like, ah. And the thing is, I don't know why I brought the knife up to my face. I've never done that before. It was just very excited in that moment. Um, so here's some questions. Did you hear Texas opened up fully? Yes. And I'm split on this because it's good that they're open. But I don't like the presumption that the governor ever had the authority to do such a thing in the first place. So that I'm kind of torn on that. It's like, yay, the governor is allowing us to go outside again. It really should have ended with that authority not being recognized either by the courts or in some manner, or even just the people refusing to obey it. That would have been preferred to, because now the governor and future governors of Texas and other states that are pulling back on these restrictions, they're basically saying, yeah, we can do this again if we want to, and that's not good. Bill Robichaud says, have you been reading Scott Horton's new book? I have not yet, but we are working on getting Scott on the show. I really want to get Scott's perspective on what's going on with the Uyghurs, because he is very upset about the way that it's being talked about in Western, but especially American media. Let's see. Chris Nelson says, I dislike the CCP, but I'm not sure playing nice with them is effective. How to be hard on them without advocating war. It's not an issue of being hard or not hard on them. And the reality is we're not playing nice. We're in a trade war with them. Our previous and now current CIA directors are all but declaring war in terms of the way that they talk about the CCP. And again, as Doug said, we don't like communists. We don't like the CCP, and we don't like the Chinese government. But when you attack a country, so for example, if a foreign government head or head of their intelligence agency or head of their military attack the U.S. government, attack the U.S. and say the Americans are doing this, we naturally come together and say, hey, screw you, pal. We're Americans. We do. Even like when we get criticized by Europe, right? They're talking about legitimate things about our government, but if they're phrasing it, well, the Americans, blah, 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 blah. And then we hear, oh, Europeans are saying bad things about Americans. And we naturally come together and go, hey, screw you, pal. That's what's happening in China. When we're saying all this stuff about, oh, well, we're against the Chinese doing this and doing that, when it's coming from the government, it comes off as, oh, they're saying this about all Chinese people. So that's not helping. The trade wars aren't helping. We've talked a lot about trade wars on this program. The reality is that when your government issues tariffs and fees and regulations on trade, they're taxing you. Your government is taxing and punishing you for trying to get the most affordable product that you can. And not only are they taxing you, but it doesn't work. If you are, for example, and I've used this example many times, if you own a company that makes large durable goods, so let's say like air conditioners or refrigerators, and you rely on raw materials and partial materials like semiconductors and things like that that go into your machine that are made in other countries like China and Mexico and things like that, that's how you're able to affordably make it here. Now, if suddenly there's tariffs on it, now you can't sell it for the same price as your foreign competitors. Now you have to pay more because you're a US-based business. That leaves you with two options. You can either jack up the price, which makes you less competitive. You can knock down your profit, which hurts your company and your shareholders, and you were probably operating on razor-thin margins to begin with. You can start laying off people and automating, but A, that's not really going to help in the short term, and B, now you're creating fewer jobs and leading to more joblessness, or you just move overseas where you're not subjected to those tariffs anymore. Tariffs and trade wars make things worse for us. And yes, they engage in it too, and it makes it worse for them. The original world wars that happened post Great Depression happened largely because of a global depression that started with, among other things, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which led to global trade wars starting in the US and in Europe and going around the world. When countries aren't trading goods and services, they typically start trading bombs and missiles. So this is an issue of the best way to do this is to, first of all, clean up our own house. It's hard for us to criticize another country's government for being repressive when our government is engaged in an imperial, endless war campaign around the world, creating terror groups, funding drug cartels, doing some of the most disgusting things around the world, and then saying, yeah, it's bad what you're doing in your country too. Yeah, we sound like massive hypocrites, or at least our government sounds like hypocrites. So number one, clean up our government's act so that we actually can come from a position of actually not sounding like massive hypocrites and ignoring the planks in our own eyes when we're trying to remove the specks from others. And then from there, we can actually start being a force for freedom. But we have to actually be a force for freedom. We just can't stamp freedom on the side of a cruise missile and go, look, we're for freedom. No, it's just as stupid as trying to stamp, people have been joking about now that Biden's in office, they're going to stamp, trans rights flags and Black Lives Matter on the side of a missile and that'll make it okay. No, it doesn't. But slapping freedom and patriotism on the side of it doesn't make it okay too. Make it okay either. So, end those things and be an actual force for good around the world and a force for freedom. Now we can actually start talking. Let's see. Did you hear that while the news suggested that legislators were going to take away Cuomo's dictator powers in New York, the Democrats actually just extended them and had Cuomo in on the discussion? That doesn't surprise me at all, honestly. I haven't been following it, but the Cuomo is in a really bad place. And interestingly enough, it might be his aggressive behavior to women, which is terrible, that will end up getting him removed, not the fact that he put COVID patients in nursing homes and led to 14,000 that we know of dying as a result of his bad policy and then lying about it to state and federal investigators. No, it's going to be that he was touchy with women, which again, terrible thing. The things he has said to women and just being a creepy, you're like in your 50s and you're being creepy with women that could easily be your daughter's age, a couple of them even your granddaughter's age. And I mean, it's really disgusting and creepy, but she also killed a bunch of people and then lied about it. So on the scale of things, so he's got a fight in for him. I'm not sure how it's going to lead to. Alexander Robinson, I don't know if it's Alexandra or Alexander, but Alex says, I would argue that COVID-19 is because of the CCP. Shouldn't they be punished for lying and covering up what was supposed to be a local pandemic into a global pandemic? For that matter, we don't know that it wasn't accidentally leaked from a lab. They actually didn't negotiated with the World Health Organization for nearly a year before they let them in. And the World Health Organization immediately upon entering said, we're not even going to investigate that because it's not likely. Okay, well, why wouldn't you still investigate the possibility of it? Sounds to me like that was a condition of them even being allowed in. Now, it could have very well been naturally zoonotic occurrence as a result of the wet markets where the different animals are all in together or whatever. We really don't know. In terms of punishing them, how? You can boycott them, but sanctions hurt you and as a consumer, and they hurt everyday Chinese people. They don't really hurt the government. In fact, they help the government to rally everyone around them and say, look at what they're doing to us. It hasn't worked in Cuba. It didn't work in Iraq. It doesn't work when it's used. The only thing it does is successfully cut ties between countries, which makes it that much easier for them to lead us to depersonalize each other, which makes it more likely for us to end up at war with each other. And I can guarantee you do not want war with China. You do not want war with China. That's not one that stays over there. That China is not Iraq after years of no-fly zones. China is not Afghanistan after years of being ravaged by the Taliban. China is a first world military that rivals ours. That would not stay there by any stretch of the imagination. You don't want that. Hannah Golematis. I'm sorry. Hannah says, I feel like we're encouraging slave labor in other countries because it's cheaper. Well, it's actually because it's more expensive here. And that's because of all of the various regulations and fees and taxes that have been put on American labor in order for large businesses to stifle their smaller competition because they always knew they could just move their base of operations overseas and leave the wells so poisoned here that it's unaffordable to do business here and compete with them. So you get rid of those regulations, not only does that help things here, but it also helps things overseas. It helps. That's actually a great way to punish China, is simply deregulate the market here, so that more jobs come back and grow here. And it's cheaper to make things here. It becomes more affordable to do business here, more affordable to hire people here, more affordable to make things here. That helps with the problem with China, because they're not as rich with our money from them being more affordable than us. It also helps with jobs here. It helps with the economy here. It helps with the environment, because we have more products being made here instead of being made on the other side of the planet and shipped over here. So that reduces the amount of pollution and the carbon footprint and all of that stuff. So, yeah. So that's actually a great way to help. Let's see what else is here. Cuomo said he definitely wasn't going to resign. I don't think he was going to resign. Yeah, I'm fully Alexander. I hope I'm saying your name right. I'm fully behind not paying them back. The whatever debt can be whatever treasury bonds can be traced to being owned by Chinese-owned banks. Just don't pay it back. That's fine. And for that matter, we could also write off, because there's a certain amount of, I think it's just under $1 trillion that Chinese government technically owes the U.S. government from during Lend-Lease I believe during World War II. And but the Chinese government doesn't recognize that debt because it was run up by the Chiang Kai-shek government. So yeah, just write that amount off of what we owe them as well. But yeah, no, we could just not pay them back. Let's see. What do you think about Biden stopping oil fracking? I'm not aware that he stopped it completely. I think he had stopped leases on oil fracking, on new leases on oil fracking. Here's what I think about oil fracking, to be perfectly honest. The reason that we are still using fossil fuels as heavily as we are is because there is a renewable or not renewable, but highly plentiful. It is the cheapest. It is the most carbon neutral. It is the most effective. It is the most steady, and it is the safest form of energy, and it's called nuclear. And the reason that we don't have more new nuclear power plants is because federal regulations and even some state regulations have made it entirely cost prohibitive to build any new nuclear plants for the past at least 30 something years. If they had more nuclear, if they were allowed to have more nuclear, and you don't have to have a government program, you don't have to subsidize it, just get rid of the regulations, put them on even footing with everyone else. And the subsidization of fossil fuels and the subsidization of renewables, and just deregulate to nuclear to the same level as every other type of energy, and you will see many new nuclear plants, including new and more efficient and safer plants like thorium salt reactors. There's so many really exciting things in the field of nuclear that are safer, that have a much shorter radioactive half-life than the old forms did, that are just better all the way around. They're smaller, so you can have them in more areas. It's easier to clean up after them. You can have them in a spot. Actually, the waste portion is portable, can be removed off-site very safely, so it doesn't even leave any radiation in that area in the groundwater. You can actually switch out cores, so you can perpetually have nuclear energy. You would see the cost of energy in general go down to a fraction of what they are now. You would see things like electric cars completely take over the car industry, because it would be exponentially more affordable to have an electric car than a gas car. So all this stuff about increased regulations that drive up the cost of things, this is the opposite way to go. When you deregulate and you allow the market to innovate by getting off their damn backs and letting them do what they do, then you end up with far better solutions like nuclear. And that allows having much more plentiful, safer, and cheaper energy, allows for the next generation of energy to come out, like fusion, like these things we're seeing, solar panels that will be up in the atmosphere, or in orbit, where they're outside of the atmosphere, where they can collect exponentially more power and beam it to certain remote locations. All of these things become better and cheaper and more easily attainable when the source of energy that is needed for all that research and production and development and everything that has to go into it is exponentially cheaper. Nuclear allows that to happen, and all we have to do is get the government off the market's back. Take one more question, then we'll close out. Here we go. What about China's debt? Brian asks, what about China's debt trap diplomacy that they have been using on poorer African and South Asian countries, loaning them large sums of money for crap infrastructure projects and then leveraging that debt against them when they can't pay to take ports and land? Is there a way we can diplomatically or strategically counter this to protect poor nations without any aggressive responses? The number one thing we could be doing, Brian, is if we got the... Right now, when you want to do any kind of diplomacy or any kind of anything related to diplomatic types of commerce in foreign country, there are actually regulations against that. You have to actually go through the State Department and, put together a white paper and get approval for them to do it because it's considered diplomatic, and you have to make sure you're not stepping on the feet of the U.S. government's foreign policy. If we simply let them do this, a lot of these projects are garbage, but no one's really engaging these developing economies in a robust way. So China comes in and says, hey, here's a boondoggle plan. It's going to make you billions of dollars. Just sign here on the dotted line. These countries that don't have experience with this go, okay, fine. They sign up. They don't have any other alternative. Again, deregulate. Allow businesses and nonprofits and NGOs and organizations here to be able to engage in this kind of diplomatic market opening commerce in other countries without having to get State Department and U.S. aid approval. And you will see a blossoming trade in these developing countries. They have the money. They have money. They have increasing amounts of money. They have emerging economies, and they're, like you said, they're getting sucked up in these garbage programs, and then they're being leveraged with a bunch of debt that they have to pay off. So give them a better alternative. Just give them a better alternative. They're just looking for something to do, honestly. There we go. Did the Jewish space laser do this? Yeah. No, I clearly can't be trusted around steak knives. 38 years of eating, I've never stabbed myself. I don't. Anyway, so folks, I guess we'll end up on we'll end on space laser. Sure, let's do that, folks. Thanks so much again for tuning into this episode of My Fellow Americans. I hope you enjoyed it. This format was kind of cool. I got to I already had it pre-recorded, so I was able to just do that and hang out with you all in the comments. That was kind of cool. Thanks again so much for tuning in. Join me next week on Tuesday for the next episode of The Muddied Waters of Freedom, where Matt Wright and I parse through the week's events like the sweet little 2020 Wonder Boys that we are, and we will talk about all the stuff that happened since the previous time that we got together. Then come right back here on Wednesday, same spike place, same spike time for the next episode of My Fellow Americans. I will have on Josh Eagle and Justin Cornett. They have a new organization called For All Tennessee. They are doing some incredible stuff in the state of Tennessee, incredible legislative accomplishments, incredible legislative goals, and as they're working on it, we'll eventually hopefully be able to expand it across the country. But they're doing great work in Tennessee already. What kind of great work? Tune in next week and you'll find out. But folks, thanks again so much for tuning in. I will talk to you very, very soon. And I was going to say the thing that I say on Muddy Waters of Freedom. I don't say that on this. Instead, what do I say on this? Gosh. Oh, I say, hey, folks, thanks again so much for tuning in. I'm Spike Cohen, and you are the power. Thanks for tuning in, guys. God bless.
disguised and guiseless like my skin was my friend. In reality, you were my kin, though I view the world through another's iris. If you slide in my kicks, it might fit. We might just unite and come together, become hybrid, at the least slightly like-minded. Indeed, the life I've lived brings light to kindness. All you need is a sign. Put a cease to the crimes, put an ease to the minds like mine. Sometimes darkness is all I find. You know what they say about an eye for an eye in a time when the blind lead the blind. Who am I to deny I would cry when a loved one dies? I recognize that body outside, but the holes in the body that was alive. Now confined to a chalk outline. Find out how, but you never know why. It ain't even make it to the news at 9. It ain't even make it to the news at 9. That's my sister, mother, father, brother, son. That's one of mine. All these tears, I close my eyes, open up to only find I'm in line. There's a pointless murder happening all the time. Either lose your life or mine, caught up in their first desire. That ain't how it started, nah. How were we supposed to survive? There's a war going on outside. Who would want to raise a child? Whom the tomb is flashing by. Now you have to say goodbye when you watch them on the news at 5. Don't tell me how, tell me why.
We